evening and welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston MediaSource TV. I'm Gene Preuss with the League of Women Voters of Houston. Today we want to talk about some incidents that happened yesterday. If you're a member of the League of Women Voters, you may have gotten an email. The League of Women Voters sent a message out yesterday denouncing the violence and attack that happened in Washington, D.C. at the United States Capitol at a time when Congress was meeting to certify the electors' ballots and results of the Electoral College votes that had taken place last month. At least a dozen people were injured, most of them police, Capitol Police, military, National Guard from Virginia and Maryland, and finally from Washington, D.C. were dispatched. Curfew has been enacted in Washington, D.C. for the next month. And one woman was fatally shot while trying to enter into one of the House chambers, and other people were severely injured. 3 other people died because of medical emergencies. Windows were smashed inside the chambers. One of the Houston representatives, a brand new freshman, Representative Troy Nels, a former sheriff of Fort Bend County, neighboring Fort Bend County, was photos of him along with Capitol Police trying to talk to the people who were trying to break into the House chambers. We've gotten reports from other representatives from the Houston area. Sylvia Garcia, Dan Crenshaw denounced the violence, as did others. So it was a traumatic day, and many of us, I was, were glued to the TV set watching what would happen. This is something that hasn't happened in Washington, D.C. The Capitol grounds have never been stormed since 1814. It's a historic day. I'm here with several political science professors. I'm going to start with Ashleen Bagnulo from Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. She's assistant professor of political science. Dr. Ann Collins, who is professor of political science at McKendree University in Lebanon, Illinois. And William Flores, well, they're all doctors, right? William Flores, who is professor of political science at University of Houston downtown. So we're from all over the state, and in fact, from other parts of the nation, although we all have Texas roots. And ironically, the viewers don't know this, but I was talking to everybody else, and Ann and I had been talking yesterday, about 24 hours ago, about riots. And shortly after the interview was over, the Capitol was invaded. And so we decided to scrap that interview and proceed with the new one. So, Ann, I want to start with you. You're an expert on riots and race riots in the United States. You have a couple of books out, Dawn Broke Hot and Somber, U.S. Riots of 1964, and All Hell Broke Loose, American Race Riots from the Progressive Era through World War II, both published by Prager. And so can you define for us, what is a riot?
Well, first of all, Gene, thanks so much for inviting me. It's good to see you again. As you said, we go way back to our graduate days, so it's good to see you. Yes. So what happened yesterday has the hallmark of riots, and especially the unrest, the violence that occurred at the turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th century, when you saw white on black violence erupting across the country. The term riot gets bandied about quite a bit. The later unrest of the 1960s, mostly scholars don't consider those riots. They consider those uprisings or revolts. So generically, a lot of violence is called a riot. And generically, kind of with a broad view, you could call them riots. I would categorize what happened yesterday war is a riot. And especially what happened, again, as I said, at the early 20th century, when you had places like Tulsa explode. That's the name of my first book. The sheriff said all hell broke loose, right? When a white mob had the intention of going to lynch someone who had been accused of something. And so there are parallels in history. 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, very similar to what happened yesterday. There was literally a coup that unseated the local government. A mob of whites actually planned and waited 2 months until the election occurred. And then they decided that was the time to act, to overthrow the government. So I know a lot of people think of riots as spontaneous, very spur of the moment. And of course, they're laden with emotion and, lots of violence and so on, but they're not necessarily spontaneous. Some of these are planned. And as I said, this has the hallmarks of that. You had a leader in our president calling for people to march down to the Capitol. And he's been sowing these seeds at the turn of the century. In the 19th and 20th century, it was newspapers. Now it's Twitter and so other form media, social media. So you had a president calling for and inciting this violence, having his followers march down to the Capitol. So there are legal, definitions of riots: 3 or more people, inciting violence, causing destruction. And then there are generic terms. But I would label this, what happened yesterday, a riot, among other things: terrorism, insurrection, sedition. There are a number of things we could call it.
So, but is it fair? Certainly they had a rally on the Ellipse, which is down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House from the Capitol. And, he was out there. We had our Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, was there saying we're going to keep fighting. But there's a difference between when people say we're going to keep fighting for justice, we're going to fight for what we believe is right, and saying, let's attack, right? Let's attack. So when was that line crossed? When people were saying, we need to defend what we believe is right. And many people don't think the elections were fair. We've got to say that, right? And look, on either side of the aisle, we've all had times when we didn't think the elections were fair. 2005, when Trump v. Gore, when Gore v. Bush, when President Bush was elected, as opposed to Al Gore, and there were questions about the election then, right? The hanging chads. Then in 2016, President Trump was elected president by the Electoral College, although he lost by about 3 million of the popular vote. And so people were upset about that. So people get upset. I mean, we're all in academia, and we all have elections to decide what we're going to do in our departments, in our colleges, in the university. And, when things don't go our way, we get upset, right? So that's not unusual. But where does it cross the line to people actually taking action?
Well, I mean, he and his followers, he and others have been sowing the seeds of this for years, and in undermining the institutions. We have a set of institutions. In a democracy, in a democratic republic, you make a pact to agree on the rules. And Al Gore himself said, while I strongly disagree with the decision of the Supreme Court, I respect it as an institution. So we have rules of the game that we follow. And President Trump has shown over the last 4 years that he's not one to follow the rules. And I don't know how many times I've said in my classes, this is not normal. This is very unusual. He's been very willing to go against the norms, the rules that we have followed for years. And so he's been sowing these seeds and so stirring the embers. And so even when you say, let's fight back, followers might hear that as another thing if you've been sowing those seeds for years and planting the seed for years.
So, Ashleen, let me get your input on this. You all are experts on the presidency, and I don't want to take that away from any of you. But let me ask you, how are we going to talk about this? Because, again, there are people who are legitimately concerned and unhappy about the election, and don't they have a right to say, "Hey, we're upset about things"?
Right. I think a lot of what's happening is that in order for a republic to work, we have to have norms that everyone respects so that they can follow them, but also so that when they have outcomes they don't like, they can at least turn their trust to the norms. And part of what we're seeing happen, rightly or wrongly, I think, is a perception that the norms are not disinterested. And so I know for me, I think that the norms are functioning justly and that they have a certain status. But when I talk to a lot of people who, for example, think that the outcome of the election isn't fair, they'll point back to other things that they think that they were tricked about. Like they'll say, well, the media hasn't been honest with us, it's liberal. Or they'll say, Trump gets reported as saying XYZ or being blamed from XYZ, but you didn't see Obama get blamed that way. And I'm not going to talk about the merits of those comparisons, but I think if we were in a functional system where people did perceive that the norms were working, what would happen is that they would be able to blow off steam about not thinking this is the correct outcome, but still defer. And like we saw Gore do, for example, when the Supreme Court made the decision that they did. That's not happening anymore. And what's happening instead is that as this regard for the norms is decreased and the persistence in the belief that the outcome was wrong, which that's happened before. Like you say, the outcome was wrong, but I'll hold to the norm. That's not happening. And as that goes on, the people who want to reject the norm and the outcome are also going to rely more extensively on alternative accounts or alternative news sources. So, for example, we've already seen this happening with a lot of the social media and sort of alternative news sources trying to prove that it was Antifa that did this. And so I think where we have this problem where our normal way of working out our displeasure and disagreement is basically not at hand. And it's going to turn more toward the conspiratorial, which I think is going to be really hard to get out of in a functional way, in a unified way.
Bill, let me ask you about your take on this. We're going to be having to have students come into our classrooms in a couple of weeks. Public school teachers have gone back today, I believe, here in Texas, and parents are going to be talking to their children about this, and loved ones and social media friends talk about this each other. How are we going to address this?
Yeah, I think this is a complicated issue, but understand that we have a divided America. You've got right after the election, 70% of Republicans felt that the election was fraudulent, that there was massive voter fraud, at least 50%. So you have a president who has consistently lied. He's distorted. There's over 25,000 misrepresentations and out-and-out lies that during his presidency he said. Now, there are many people who believe them. And unfortunately, it's had an effect of eroding faith on the electoral process. So when you have a profound division in reality, how you see it, how you describe it, how you relate it. It makes it very difficult to have an opportunity to explain it. We have what took place yesterday was seditious. There's federal law, and the federal law states that if you, in fact, let me read it here. Hold on a second. If you by force prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force seize, take, or possess any property of the United States contrary to the authority thereof, you can be imprisoned. That's seditious. They have done this on federal law in federal property at a time when it really, the most important part of our democracy, the election of the president, the counting of the votes, and the ascertaining that the votes, the accepting, which is in Congress, is supposed to be really a simple act. You're hearing that it's already been confirmed from each state is responsible for confirming the electoral votes. Congress receives them and accepts them. The only time there's been challenges was when back in, I think, the 1870s, when two slates were brought from one state. And that's why the law was changed to give Congress the ability to determine which is the appropriate slate if there's two slates coming in. That's not occurred here. So the idea that you'd have over 100 Republican congressmen and 11 senators that were advocating, protesting the different states that were, and the outcome of those elections, that is a point in history that we have not had. That set the stage. And you know, it's not just what Trump said, it's the enablers of Trump, but it's also the conspirators that organized these events with QAnon, with Proud Boys, with other organizations, with the use of the dark web to actually communicate that we're going to start this, we're going to march from the rally, and we're going to take over the Congress. That is conspiracy. This is a dark moment in the history of this country.
Well, there certainly is.
And I think it's going to be difficult to explain to our kids if we don't do something about it. I think those who are courageous, those Republicans, and there's really only a handful right now, who've spoken out in protesting and saying that this was wrong, and only one that has come forward to say, you know, Trump has to leave or be removed from office. And at this point in time, that's what needs to take place.
So we saw, to follow up on what you're saying here, and I've got to say, Mitt Romney made a impassioned speech.
Absolutely.
Or Mitch McConnell made a speech on the Senate side, talking about giving up the challenges from within. And certainly, you know, there have been other challenges that representatives and senators, and they have to agree, right? You have to have the House and you have to have the Senate, a senator and a representative who have to challenge a state's electoral vote, and then they debate about it and whether or not they're going to accept it or not. And so the Senate, Mitch McConnell, have been saying, you know, we need to put this aside and put this to rest and just move on. And we know that in the Senate there were challenges, and the Senate, for the most part, declined after 5 hours of being put away for safekeeping, hidden in the recesses of the Capitol building or in their offices, decided, look, we're not going to support those challenges anymore. And I will say this, that Florida representative, the outgoing representative, Kelly Loeffler, who lost the election, and this is another issue, right, that probably antagonized or fed the flames, is that in Georgia, both Republican senators were defeated. And so you're going to have Democrats. So that, and the import of that is that now the Senate is going to be divided 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. And people say, well, that's it's 50-50. No one has a majority, but the president of the Senate, it will be Kamala Harris. So it will be a Democrat. So technically they will have a majority now. So that's going to change things politically in Washington, D.C., with the House, the presidency, and the Senate being all one party. And that hasn't happened in quite some time. So people are upset, right? And understandably so. And I've got to say, I do not oppose protests. I mean, and certainly I know people get upset about these things, and whether or not somebody's taking a knee at a football game or raising their fist during the 1968 Olympics, people don't like protest. The Dixie Chicks got into a lot of trouble. The Chicks now got into a lot of trouble at a concert in London by criticizing the U.S. president. We don't like that. We don't like protests, but it's something our nation was built on, was protest, right? And we have that as part of our First Amendment right, the right to speak out and not be held accountable to it. But again, the fact that it crossed the line this time is really what has people upset. So let me throw something else in here. I was doing some research a couple of weeks ago on cults and cult behavior. So let me give you some characteristics that people say are common among cults. The group displays excessive, zealous, and unquestioning commitment to its leader as the truth, the law. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged and even punished. The group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society. The group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. So, not to say, and I don't believe this, right, that all Republicans feel this way or all conservatives feel this way. And there's many reasons why people are conservative and people are Republican, vote Republican, that are not, and we hear this on social, they're because they're racist or because, no, I mean, there people have legitimate reasons for seeing this. But when we're talking about QAnon or some of these other groups, even Antifa and others on the left wing, on both sides, are there not characteristics of this cult-like behavior in politics, Anne?
Well, absolutely. I mean, even yesterday, you saw people with a lot of Trump flags trying to hoist the Trump flag, not the American flag, as they were breaking into the Capitol, and sadly also the Confederate flag, right? So there are a lot of layers to this, and I would say that Trump and the Republicans, many of the Republicans seemed surprised and taken aback that they had lost control of this situation. They're for whatever reason they are terrified. They're terrified of losing Trump's supporters. But I don't know that Trump supporters are going to be tapping into the traditional established Republican ideology. I do believe you're onto something with they're much more devoted to Trump and his brand and his beliefs and his style.
Ashleen?
Discussing this with friends and colleagues, I think one thing that is strikingly cult-like is the fact that I'm not saying he's like Charles Manson, but think about Charles Manson and how part of what he used the cult to do was to send them to do things that they could get into trouble for legally, that they could get killed for, to put them in a more exposed place and to keep himself safe, and to have them do his bidding at the same time. And if you look at the way that Trump has over time made gestures to the Proud Boys and to his supporters, and then meeting with the Proud Boys 2 weeks before this happened at the White House, and then having that speech that he gave before any of this happened on the Ellipse, all of this to me looks like somebody who expects a certain level of obedience and who wants to get his political actors or his just actors generally out there because he knows they'll be committed enough to do it if he says so. And that's really dangerous for politics. And probably one of the ways that this has most reminded me of cult-like behavior, because it's not just that they have a sort of devotion to him, it's that they've got obedience. And he's exploiting that.
Bill, what do you think?
I think it's this is going to be a very important time for the Republican Party because, you know, the party has got to be able to distinguish itself from this cult and from the cult leader. The leaders of the Republican Party, up until some last night, Lindsey Graham, for example, made an impassioned speech just before the vote, which was the first time that he came out, saying basically, look, I didn't want Biden to win. I campaigned against him. He won. Let's accept it. On the 20th, they're going to become president and vice president. It's over. And I think that was, McConnell and Graham both took a rational approach. I agree with Ashleen. The cult following is not going to follow them. In fact, Trump has attacked them and attacked his own vice president, his own attorney general, he's forced to resign, who, by the way, issued a very strong statement today condemning the actions of President Trump as inciting the riot and insurrection. The truth of the matter is that you're going to have some courageous people on the right step forward and distinguish themselves from the cult. They're going to have, some are already doing that. They're doing it in baby steps. They're saying what took place was wrong because it was violent. What took place was wrong because it's undermined our democracy and it was violent. And they're going to have to look at their own role in undermining our democracy. Now, we have to have an opposition. We have to have, the liberal and the conservative elements of our country are essential for our democracy. So we have to have a vibrant Republican Party, or whatever comes out of it that emerges in the future if it tears itself apart. They have to find their fiber, what they stand for, and begin to distinguish themselves very clearly from Donald Trump and from all of that cult, and begin to affirm reality and fact rather than conspiracy theories and lies.
Okay, so those are you bring up some very good questions. So, a couple of things. One, and you don't have to remember all these. I don't know if I will, but I'd like to talk about some issues. What is going to be the future of the Republican Party? Some people have already said, it's no longer, when I was growing up, or at least when I was an adult, it was the party of Reagan. But that doesn't seem to be the case any longer. And people say, oh, it's now the party of Trump. He has left an indelible mark on the Republican Party. That's one thing. The second thing is as I mentioned now, is that, now the Democrats are in charge of the White House, Congress, and how is that going? I was going to say not the Supreme Court, but I mean, you've got the Democrats in charge of two parties. And I agree. I do think that you do always need some alternative viewpoints.
Can I just start on that? Because,
sure.
Just to say that I think what you're going to see is suddenly the Republicans who have supported huge deficits, opposed to money for stimulus because it's going to profoundly destroy our economy. They're going to suddenly find their conservative roots. And unfortunately, that's not if they want to lead, they're going to have to work with the Democrats. They're going to have to work with Biden to handle some very difficult times we have with the coronavirus and massive unemployment. And it's not going to be done by more tax cuts.
Ashleen, let me circle back to you and ask, what do you think on this? And look, there are conservative issues that actually even some Democrats agree on, and like right to life is a big issue among conservatives, fiscal conservatism, and that's not; those aren't necessarily limited to just one party. You also see Democrats espousing this. How do you think the Republican Party is going to be affected in the years to come, and about one party controlling the lawmaking and the executive branch?
So I think we're definitely in political realignment right now. And one of the things I've noticed, for example, just locally, so I'm in New Braunfels, Texas. That's where I live. We have a very aggressive pro-Trump sort of group that rallies and goes into businesses without masks and stuff. But the reason I bring that up is because local politicians who are conservative are really afraid of them. And the reason is because they are always threatening to put up their own candidate. And one of the things that's happening at the national level is basically that same dynamic. They don't want to be primaried by people who are further right to them, who the Trump people will then move to. They want to be able to keep their seats and also not go all the way in that direction. And that's going to become, I think, less and less possible. They are going to be primary. There's going to be huge infighting, I think, between the conservatives. And one of the problems that we're looking at is the place where the energy is in terms of the devotion is on the side of the more Trump-oriented voters. And so they're not going to listen to Mitch McConnell telling them to stop. In fact, that's going to mean to them that they can't trust him anymore. So I think you'll have the Republican Party basically fall apart. And whether they actually do fall apart or not, or they just kind of change character a lot, remains to be seen. And I think the fact that we will have Democrats having control of the presidency and the legislature will just exacerbate that, because a lot of conservatives feel panicked. I like you mentioned earlier, part of the reason that this riot happened, maybe with the intensity it did, was because of the outcomes in Georgia. And I think this feeling of panic and of needing to do anything to defend yourself is probably going to continue to haunt the Republicans. What would be good is if what you saw happen, you pointed to maybe shared interests in right to life issues, or shared interests maybe in fiscal issues, shared interests even if you're thinking about the sort of burgeoning populist movement, if you want to talk about it in a different direction, of redistribution from major companies down to the employees. What would be good is if these issues would form groups that crossed the boundaries and would begin to attract some of the conservatives maybe toward being willing to work with and maybe even to identify with the Democrats and maybe moderate them. So if it's a time of political realignment, basically anything can happen. It's not just the conservatives that are going to change. The progressives and the Democrats will too. So our best thing would be if we could have the realignment happen in a way that moves both parties more towards stability.
Anne, what do you think?
I'll just add a few comments. I agree with both of what's been said so far. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a number of statements that Trump may be going away, but Trumpism is not. And so it's here for the duration for some time. And of course, also, you know, Trump didn't start all this. The roots of this go way back. So he's helped manifest this and bring it out in the open more. And I do think we're going to have to figure out a way. You know, the Senate's very, very even, right? So that, you know, even though the Democrats are going to have the White House and both chambers of Congress, they're not going to be able to go too far in what they do with legislation. Georgia certainly helped, especially with Biden's cabinet positions and so on. He's going to have an easier time getting things done. And now as minority leader, Mitch McConnell might be more willing to work with him. I think as majority leader, he may not have worked very well, but now that he's in the minority. But, you know, again, to reiterate, we're going to have to find a way to the establishment to work together, but also to figure out, you know, Trumpism and the people who have bought into this. And, you know, kind of this ideology, we're going to have to figure out, you know, how we talk to them and how we, you know, exist as Americans together. And I'm not talking about, you know, I'm not talking about allowing racism and so on to exist. It does exist, but we've got to figure out a way to, you know, be peaceful and try to get people to, I don't know. It's going to be difficult. But Biden and Harris have a hard road ahead.
I don't think it's going to be easy. One of the other things that I think, you know, as a historian and as political scientists, we have to come to grips with is the new way we communicate. And, you know, Donald Trump has made social media, has made effective use of social media. Now, an amazing thing happened that is going to cause a lot of consternation, but also relief among others, is he has been barred now, and they say even perhaps permanently, from Facebook. His Twitter account has been blocked. But I want to share something with you and with the audience that this is no longer available on TV or on Twitter. Can you see this screenshot that I'm sharing with you?
Yeah, you might help to read it because it's little. It does. You can see the white, but it's
the contrast is bad, contrasty. So this is something that he tweeted out yesterday, and he received a lot of criticism, you know, and even some members of his staff and the First Lady's staff resigned. There have been reports that some other high-level members of his staff have resigned because they didn't think, you know, what hand did he have in the insurrection? And there were concerns that he wasn't responding quickly enough. And so one of the things he did make a video that he posted, and that has raised some questions. But then he also sent out this tweet, and he said these things that are going on and events that are happening when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. These are the things and events that happen when this happens. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. Now, that has... you know, people have been confused about those types of things. But what about the effect of social media and, I mean, how messages like this have exacerbated the problem? And you want to start with that?
I mean, yeah. It's, I mean, poured fuel on the fire. You know, you and I talked about this yesterday. There are some good things about social media, like us connecting, but there are also some very dangerous and detrimental aspects of social media. And again, just like newspapers in the early 20th century, social media has played a fundamental role in fueling this hatred and this, flaming the issues that people perceive as problems, right? So, again, some of the scholars call this fire tending. People are kind of stoking the embers, and Trump's been very effective at that over the last few years, right? Keeping those flames, tended. That he's been doing that. And one of the things I think I was trying to get to in my last response is, he's done a lot to undermine institutions, even education. Often we say, well, education is the answer. People live in bubbles, and we try to, if only people could meet with other people and talk and get educated, that would help. It's going to be very difficult. And social media has certainly played a huge role in kind of dividing us and putting us in our own echo chambers.
Another thing that's really interesting about social media is the way it presents itself with authority. So if you have people who are just scrolling through and they see like a meme or a statement that communicates to them, I don't know, for example, a QAnon conspiracy, or that talks about how Trump is going to save the republic, or that says that the Democrats want to, take away all of their guns. And I've seen different examples of these memes. If someone is not really exposed to the internet very often, or wasn't, like they didn't grow up with it, and then they see those memes, sometimes studies have shown that they might see that as more authoritative than someone who has grown up in a sort of digital age. Another problem, though, to talk about age differences, though, is that the radicalization of younger people is happening in chat rooms and in chat forums, basically, where you're not just seeing misinformation, but you're seeing also a lot of articulation of the kinds of group identity and aims that young people really gravitate towards. So in the past, we might have had a problem with drugs and with gangs. Now we have a problem with, Johnny getting online and joining white supremacists, who then, tell him to wear some horns and go in a cape to the, Capitol. So we're kind of in a problem, I think, of technology changing what we think is reality. And for politics, that's a huge can of worms.
The other thing, of course, is the hacking of media, and the way that in 2016 the Russians were able to actually go in and create, using bots to create false accounts and foment, agitate, to add to the fuel of the fires on both sides, and in agitating the right and the left to try and get people to confront each other. Social media can be a very powerful tool, but unfortunately, in the wrong hands, it can be a very dangerous one. And what we've seen with Trump is that it has been a very dangerous one. I think, it's sort of like the fact that Twitter is now closing down his account 13 days before he's leaving office is sort of like the farmer building a fence after the wolf and all of his friends have come in and eaten all the sheep. You've got, why didn't they respond earlier when they've been watching all of this? They've seen it. They've seen its impact, but they didn't do anything about it. And part of that reason is that they were fearful that the Congress, which was investigating them and talking about, Facebook and Twitter and Google being monopolies, we're going to shut them down or put more restrictions on them. And I think, the politics also shapes this, because there's been when they have shut down conservative sites, and the conservative sites have generally been ultra right-wing groups that have called for violence. But the Republicans, unfortunately, have tended to say, see, they're attacking conservatives, rather than correctly saying they're acting judiciously in shutting down irresponsible speech. And I think we really have to look at that much more thoroughly, because Congress does have the authority and should regulate social media and some of these big platforms. But at the same time, it shouldn't bring politics in the way that it has to try and say, okay, you can't shut down anybody because you're shutting down the Proud Boys or some other ultra, whether it's right or left organization. I think we have to have free expression, but at the same time, we have to have some restraints on it, because we can't have people advocating to incite riots and things like yesterday.
Well, this is a good point, right? We talk about our First or Second Amendment rights. Those, there's an argument that those are the only two rights we talk about in discussion anymore: First and Second Amendment.
Pretty much.
But the Supreme Court has ruled that all of the rights that we enjoy are not absolute rights. What is it? We were talking, I think, about the Abrams case, and in subsequent cases yesterday. Ann and I, there was a professor that made us read a book. He was a conservative. And a historian who made us read this book on the Abrams case and about the limits of freedom of expression.
Absolutely.
And we have to realize that whether we like it or not, and nobody likes to post stuff that's fact checked, right? By gosh, I'm telling you the truth as I know it. And I saw it on Facebook, so it must be accurate. We don't like to be fact checked, but everybody across the political spectrum from time to time will get false information. I mean, right now, for heaven's sake, I want to talk to the people with the Harris County Health Department, because we see so much misinformation about COVID. And, this is something that's gradually unfolding on a day-to-day basis. New information becomes available. As people in academia, we maybe are more used to having people challenge us regularly on things that we say, right? We write things and you get some reviewer who says, oh, that's wrong. You say, well, I researched it. I know it's right. But, we get that. We don't like it, but we get it. But not everybody gets those filters. And so they may not be as used to them as we are. That doesn't mean that we like them anymore, but that those things happen. So I think that is going to be a big issue. Is the idea of social media. How are we discerning? How does, so what is it called? Media literacy is a big issue now among academics and teachers. And I know that teachers at the high schools are dealing with this as well. Is when you have told people that you can't trust the media. And look, as a historian and somebody who's worked in the media, this idea that the media is fair and impartial is not historically true of media. In the days of the Revolution and up until about, I guess, the 1850s and 60s, media was actually partisan, right? There were Democratic newspapers, there were Whig newspapers, there were Republican newspapers, and the media that you got had what we call confirmation bias, right? This was written by people for people to have information to spread out. So the idea of media being unbiased, where people still have that today and they think, well, this is how it's always been. No, it hasn't been. We have to exercise some discernment, some judgment. How are you going to be telling your students to be mindful of these, Ashleen?
That's a really good question. I think one thing I've noticed with my students is that they've been brought up in sort of this hyper-partisan mode. So regardless of what side they're on, they already have their sort of preferred media sources, and it's really hard to get them to look at other ones because they've already come to the belief that those aren't trustworthy. One of the things that I want to teach them to do is to be able to try to verify the information that they see, and to be comfortable looking at statistics and at historical events enough on their own that they don't need like an interpreter, a media type interpreter, to relay a history or statistical analysis to them. And I'm hoping that those tactics will help, though one of the problems with this I've started to notice is that, and this just reinforces the problematic nature of social media, is they have to have really good judgment to be able to chase the facts themselves. Because let's say they get onto Twitter and they're pursuing looking at voting machines in Georgia or something, and then they fall into the wrong accounts with, you know, I've had students who've done this with partial photos of documents or with misleading information about how elections are run. Well, they think that they're doing their own research, but on the other hand, they don't have the ability to judge the sources. And I can try to work on that, but that is becoming increasingly hard as social media proliferates sources.
Anne, what do you have to say? How are you going to
So every class period in my American politics class, we actually start out with the news. I have them, you know, because many of them don't follow the news other than, you know, maybe the occasional Twitter, you know, looking at Twitter or something on Facebook that they claim is the news. And so we start out talking about the news every day and try not to get carried away with that, because we could talk about that the whole class period, day to day. So they always have to tell their source to one another. And we talk about, okay, well, why might that particular source be problematic? Is it trustworthy? You know, and then what else did you look at? Did you confirm, you know, what are other sources who might have a different bias? What are they saying about it? And if someone, you know, again, tells me they read something on Facebook, we can pretty quickly say, well, okay, you know, again, where did that come from? Is it really reliable? And we talk, you know, we look at some news organizations that might be a little more professional and legitimate.
Bill?
Yeah, you know, when I teach American government courses, and you know, and by the way, the Texas government is the same way. You have to bring in, when you're teaching about voting, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in the country as a whole. If you know, and tie it so they're seeing the concept, they're understanding what the concept is, but they're seeing the application in real life. You know, in many respects, we're at a great time, and even though a very dangerous one, where because of this, you know, the being parts of elections, seeing firsthand, you know, what took place yesterday, seeing how people respond, it gives them something to talk about, something to think about, something to read about. And I think it's incumbent on us not just to use the textbook, but as you were saying, Ann, to be able to get them to discuss what they are seeing. And Ashleen, what you were saying, to also to give them the tools so that they're challenging what they're seeing. You know, they're challenging sources, they're challenging facts. You know, a lot of us, I remember telling my dad one time, you know, everything I learned I'm learning in college, everything that I learned in high school was wrong. And then when I went to graduate school, you know, I realized so much of what I learned in undergraduate was wrong. And in many respects, in graduate school, they teach us to challenge. And they teach us to challenge data, to challenge sources, to challenge methodology. It's hard for us to do that with freshman students. But if we don't help them to understand fact from fiction and truth from propaganda, then they're not going to be armed with the tools that are essential for 21st century learning, which is critical thinking. You know, it's not just enough to do multiple choice tests. They've got to write, they've got to think, they've got to express themselves, they've got to explain ideas. And I think that's incumbent on us to make sure whatever discipline we're teaching, that we give them those sets of tools, because then they can be active and engaged citizens, and it's essential for our democracy.
Well, I think that's all very good information. There is a website, and I'm asking you this because I'm dealing with these issues as well. Stanford Educational Group out of Stanford University. Stanford, what is it called? History Education Group. They have a civic online reasoning, and they're looking at ways, and this is available for anybody who wants to look at it. It's cor.stanford.edu. And they said, they're looking at teaching digital literacy and digital literacy evaluation, but by looking at how fact checkers work, and these hated fact checkers, how do they go about doing what they're doing? And rather than there's an old way of looking at evidence. Where does the source come from and all this? But what is the evidence? How does it read laterally? Like, you look at other data and you compare it. Where does this fit into the thing? Are there references? And also click restraint. Is there authority, as some of you were saying? And I think that, this is something parents are going to have to deal with if they're homeschooling right now, and a lot of parents are doing that, or even if they're getting online education, they're still doing a lot of it at home. People are, students and children have questions about this. Adults have questions about how do we know what is right and accurate. And like I said, when I came into as a historian, came in, and I had heard a lot of things that I would now call conspiracy theories, that you look at, how many people were on the grassy knoll, how many, did we really land on the moon? And, we look at sometimes this evidence that is out there that are oftentimes just events that happen simultaneously. And as the data number crunchers tell me, correlation does not equal causation. And that's something that I always have to, when we're talking about data, I have to think about, is that just because something seems to or might be correlated doesn't mean that it causes that. And we times look at the big picture, and sometimes we see things that aren't there. Other times we see things that are true. So I think it's a good discussion that we need to have and continue to have with ourselves and with our children and with our students, certainly. We're running out of time, and I want to wish all of you a happy new year, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. I mean, we're all busy getting ready for the next school semester to begin. Certainly, teachers are out there. I've tried contacting some government officials about appearing on the show, and it's not a good time in January, early in the month, because people are in Congress, in the Texas legislature and House. They're getting ready for this year, getting ready for the new session to begin. And with all the events of yesterday, this is going to be, I think, a very busy session for lawmakers and for us in the general public as well. And so thank you very much. Happy New Year. And thank you for agreeing to appear on such short notice.
Thanks so much, Jean.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Jean. And it's great to see you, Ashleen, again, and Anne, to meet you as well.
Great seeing you.
Same here.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Take care.